Hey folks, it's Nate back bringing you another Iron Age comic review, and today we're looking at Earthbound Grand Prix. This is volume 2 of 6, or part 2 of 6. I'm not quite sure what the terminology here is, but my copy of the comic just came in yesterday, and I actually pushed this review back a day so I could do a reread of volume 1 and kind of refresh my memory on a couple of things and get back around to this. So I've read this twice, as is my want when I'm doing a comic review, and I have a lot of thoughts. I'm going to be deviating a little bit from my standard review format here. I'm not going to do like an in-depth critique of this just yet. I'm holding off until I have an idea of what the entire series is going to be like. But because Narwhal is doing something very different here, and this is kind of more an ongoing mini-series than it is a complete story in each volume, I'm going to indulge a little bit in speculation on this one, just because I think that's part of the fun of an ongoing series in this particular format. Let me start by saying that normally when I do these reviews, I do try and tiptoe around spoilers some, at least for the review portion. And I did that, I think, in volume 1. But this is an ongoing series, and the continuity between volumes is extremely strong. I'm going to have to spoil a decent chunk of volume 1 in order to talk about volume 2. So I'm just going to give like a very broad overview here, I think, at first. And then I'm going to, well, I guess I can say right away, I do recommend this book. Like I recommend all of Narwhal stuff, because I think he is a talent to watch. And this really shows the development of his storytelling style. When you compare it to something like the original Earthbound, which was it had a lot more dialogue. And this, on the other hand, has a lot of really clever uses of shots and visual storytelling that I'm going to get into. But the story itself is also extremely entertaining. I don't think it's quite as innovative as Foreign Agent was, which was a very visually driven story that did a lot with language barriers and hidden information and stuff like that. Excuse me, stuff like that, which I thought was really good. But this story is still a ton of fun, and it has a lot of interesting visual bits to it. And seeing Narwhal play around with the elements of a much longer running story is also very entertaining. If you're not familiar, this is the follow-up to the original Earthbound, Between Two Breaths on Earth. And this continues that story in a number of ways. WizKid, Spaceman, and Julia, the three protagonists of that story, for lack of a better way to describe them, the main characters of that story, were all in contention to enter a thing called the Grand Prix. And this is, of course, Earthbound Grand Prix, in which we are actually seeing the Grand Prix play out, and we're getting a lot of answers about what was going on there. I talked a lot more about the setup for this story in my previous video, and I don't intend to rehash a lot of it here, other than to say we got introduced to the mechanics that really make this competition work. It is kind of a death battle type thing, and there are apparently 13 sponsors, at least, possibly more. I don't know as I've ever seen a number above 13, though. We sometimes run into these in person, but typically we just hear them referred to by their number, and that's how I know there's at least 13, because the 13th sponsor is referenced on a semi-regular basis. And there is kind of a reincarnation mechanic to this. So there are these things called butterfly rings, and when a person wearing a butterfly ring dies, their soul is moved into a soul catcher, which then generates a new body for them to live in, and they don't fully die. They get to come back. This is what basically drives the Grand Prix, what makes it work. And it is also the prize for winning a Grand Prix, we find out in Volume 2. So very interesting elements at work there. All in all, what I find fascinating about this is the world building. Like, the characters are kind of interesting, and there's a lot of intrigue specifically in this book between Julia and WizKid. which I'm excited to see play out over the course of the story. But this book is almost entirely about Temple 1, which is the sort of venue for the Grand Prix competition. And it's mostly introducing us to characters. It's introducing us to the ideals, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it, of the Grand Prix, and a little bit of the galaxy as a whole, although we got a lot more of that in Volume 1. The thing that really fascinated me about this book is there is just a couple of pages here in the middle where we're reintroduced really to the butterfly ring, and we're given a soliloquy about what it means to have one. Does it make you special? Is it a weapon of war? Is it a sign of being a better quality person? All of these other things that are very clearly an important concept to the people who put on the Grand Prix. And at the same time, since it's presented to us in this speech by one of the organizers, we kind of look at it from the outside with a certain degree of skepticism, because we get it in a venue that is kind of unsettling and extremely unnatural. And it really feels like Temple 1 is a nasty place, which is not surprising given that it's the venue for a death battle. But it's a nasty place in a very different way from something like the Capitol in the Hunger Games. Death battles are not new ideas. Obviously, they go back at least to ancient Rome and probably before that. But the Grand Prix has a unique feel to it, in particular because the competitors are all people of high power and high standing. They're all looking to get their hands on a little bit of that sweet, sweet immortality. It's a very fascinating new take on the genre. And, when I first heard the concept of the Grand Prix brought up in the original Earthbound, I was like, I don't know if I'm too interested in that. That's already been done. But the idea that this is in the offing for a chance to be, not just to survive, which is the somewhat repetitive motif of most death battle type stories, but to prove that you are of a higher caliber than everyone else, to kind of elevate yourself into a sort of aristocracy, is very fascinating, and is an interesting look at this very strange and alien galaxy that is outside of Earth in Narwhal's imagination. It's a really fun read. Now, this doesn't really resolve anything. It does pick up some of the plot threads from the first volume, and it continues them very well. In particular, there is a character introduced in the last couple of pages of Volume 1 that gets a lot of screen time in here, and also serves to introduce us to some of the ideas and gambits that could be at play here. One of the interesting things about Temple 1 is that not everybody who is there wants to remain there, but the only way to leave is to apparently die and then be reborn through a soul catcher, which means you need a butterfly ring. And after a butterfly ring is used, it dissolves, so it's gone. It's a one-use item. So it's very difficult to get out of Temple 1. And we see people try some very interesting and creative things to get their hands on a butterfly ring so they can escape from the Grand Prix. And we see some fascinating ways that people can try and hide where a butterfly ring is. And no one ever really knows if one is in play, or whether a person wants to win a fight and kill you, or if they just want to get themselves killed and have their butterfly ring kick in. If a butterfly ring is separated from you, like if the hand wearing the ring gets cut off, it won't activate when you die later. So that adds another wrinkle to it. One of the great things about Narwhal's stories is he always comes up with these interesting and creative mechanics, and then he plays with them in various ways. One of my favorite ways he does that in this book, and I don't know if I can find the exact page in here, because there are no page numbers. Yes, there's my personal hobby horse again. But there is a shot in here where we see a character crawling under a table at a big dinner, and they spot a person wearing one of these rings on their foot. And like right away, that is a great idea for how to play around with this butterfly ring mechanic. Very good stuff. So this is not just a installment in a story that kind of tells its own mini story that then progresses a larger meta narrative, which makes it hard to really talk about what was accomplished in here. I think it's a good light beat given where we are in the story. At the end of Volume 1, we were headed into the Grand Prix, and everything was quite heavy. People were going to be facing down death, especially if they didn't have butterfly rings already. And there was a lot of scheming and backstabbing and getting ready for, different gambits to run during the competition. So Volume 2 is a much lighter and more slapstick bit, for lack of a better way to put it. We are reintroduced to all the major fighters, and then there is a banquet to welcome them to Temple 1, which devolves into a food fight. It's very funny, but it also lets us see kind of the attitudes every character has, both in the dinner banter building up to the food fight, and then in the way they react once the food fight begins. They're very interesting and well-considered hints at the characters we're going to be dealing with once the stakes get higher again and we move into the Grand Prix itself. Very good bit of character exposition in a very light-handed and entertaining way. I like that a lot. So all in all, I think this is a great book. I think it's worth getting your hands on if you enjoy this kind of a story. But I don't know if this is the best format to get it in. Of course, because what we have here is a staple-bound book. The paper stock here is really great. The cover is just a little bit thicker and sturdier than the rest of the pages, which is not a knock on the cover, but rather a compliment to the rest of the pages, which are very, very good quality paper. However, they are just bound with a couple of staples. And if you really want to hang on to your books for a long time, you might want to wait until potentially there is a glue-bound or even hardbound version of this to purchase instead. Personally, I really like this as a very readable format, and I think I'm going to collect all 6 of these and have these as the thing to read, and then have like if there's an omnibus edition I can get my hands on, I will hang on to that as kind of like my collector's shelf piece. Either way, I think it is well worth reading if you're into sci-fi. In the previous volume, I mentioned that Narwhal has kind of changed up his approach to coloring, and he has adapted a much more muted kind of blue and earth tones kind of a palette for this story. And in the previous volume, that could kind of turn a little bit muddy because of how dark some of the panels were and how thin Narwhal's line work can often be. Well, I'm pleased to report that he has found a good balance that manages to keep that more muted tone of the art or of the coloring, but still lets the art shine through. You can see it on pages like this, where obviously this is a darker part of the sci-fi setting, but really you can still tell what everything is very clearly. The foreground characters pop out of the background fairly well. It solves a lot of the issues that he was having in that first volume, which made the pages a little bit harder to read. So I'm really glad to see that, because it does make it a lot easier to just glance over a page, get an idea of what's going on, and then go back and do the reading of all the speech bubbles and whatnot, and not have to spend a ton of time like tracing over each panel and trying to figure out what's going on in it. So yeah, it's great to see these little evolutions in style and how you account for them as it kind of changes the things you've gotten used to. I always like seeing artists evolve like this. Josh Adams of the Godfo universe is also showing a lot of that kind of evolution. He's adding color to his work. Narwhal has gone back and forth between black and white and color. And each time things get a little more defined and a little more refined. Of course, the big thing for Narwhal is whether you really like his extremely loose and extremely sketchy style. It is a style that primarily emphasizes motion and color, and it is not a highly rendered style. Of course, he can draw in a highly rendered style. If you've seen some of his cover pieces, you're familiar with that. But it is really more about the use of color and lighting to create mood, which you can kind of see on this page here. And there are obvious features to people, but there isn't a ton of that really heavy line work that makes everything just, really rough and immediate. Narwhal's art is, like, the word I keep coming back to is it's very light. It wants to move. It's not a pound cake that you can really chew on and will sit heavy in your stomach. It's more like a souffle, and it's very light on the tongue, or on the eyes in this case. And it really pops and lets you enjoy it, and then you're ready to move on to the next thing. I think it suits his very frantic pace of storytelling very well, but I recognize it's not for everyone. So all in all, Earthbound Grand Prix Volume 2, I enjoyed it a lot. I recommend it. I'm looking forward to seeing more. Let's talk a little bit about speculation. And we are going to, this is the part, I think, where a lot of spoilers are going to come about. We know that the Seven Sisters from Earthbound were killed, or at least heavily injured, in the previous volume. And they've become this interesting, the remains of their body were turned into an interesting serum. I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe the sisters themselves may have been preserved using butterfly rings. In fact, that was one of the things that kind of introduced this concept to us. But right now, they are apparently being turned into some kind of drug, as odd as that sounds. And we see that pass through several hands in this story. And we also get some other intrigue with Julia, because it turns out that she has arrived with a princess of some sort, and while Julia is a very dangerous woman, the princess she's come with is the one who's actually going to be competing in the Grand Prix. That's very interesting. She's got a chip on her shoulder when she sees WizKid, which I can understand. She's in the situation she's in largely because of WizKid, because he bailed on her and Bogart. But we don't really get a whole lot with her in this volume. I think that either we're going to find Julia is running some kind of scheme, and she's trying to get out from under the thumb of the people who have been holding her captive since WizKid disappeared from Earth, or she's here on a personal vendetta, and she wants to get the pound of flesh out of WizKid, so to speak. As I mentioned, there was a girl introduced to the story at the end of Volume 1, and she kind of sneaks out of her house, or out of her apartment, and through the air vents to this welcome banquet for the Grand Prix competitors, and she sneaks around under the table. I don't know what's going on with that, but clearly she's going to be interesting. She's the only person, for example, who knows that at least one person is wearing a butterfly ring on their feet, and I can't imagine that's not important. So I don't know how that's going to play in yet, but I'm very interested to find out, because I have collaborated with Narwhal in the past. We've worked on writing some stories. I know how his brain works. He didn't put that detail there for nothing. I can't tell you why he put it there, but I know it's deliberate. Let's see, other things. Spaceman continues to be MIA. I'm very, very interested in seeing where Spaceman is. There is the possibility, of course, that Spaceman was the soul that was caught in a soul catcher at the beginning of Earthbound Volume 1, or Grand Prix Volume 1, rather. We don't know for sure, but the ending of this book sure tells us that that soul is going to be important very soon. And I'm immensely curious what we're going to find out about all of that. All in all, this is a very good middle chapter to an ongoing story, and I enjoyed it a lot. But it's really hard to say much about it without any of the later pieces to draw on. So, what while I do recommend picking up this book and the rest of the Grand Prix series, whether individually or as a set, if a complete set ever appears, it's very hard for me to talk too much about what we get here. Besides what I've already said, I think the setup of the food fight as a way to kind of introduce all the characters and the setting in a very lighthearted way that keeps the story moving is quite good. And it sounds odd to say that's all that happens in here because it's actually a fair amount. But that's really all that happens in here. We get some more character buildup, we get introduced to the new venue, and we get an action set piece that gives us a decent insight into all the characters. I think that last bit is actually kind of important because there was not a ton of action in Earthbound Grand Prix Part 1. So it's nice to see the return of the patented Narwhal chaos scene, because there's several great shots of chaotic fighting going on in this volume. Yeah, those are my thoughts. Let me know what you thought of it. If you've read it, down below in the comments. Let me know where you think Spaceman is, if he's coming back at all. Let me know what you think Julia's problem is. And while you're down there, there's a like button and a subscribe button. You can use those as you see fit. And I'll talk to you later.